Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. It's fantastic that we can all be studying this together, even though sadly we can't be physically together. This is a really exciting experiment for me because on Shabbat mornings in Kinloss Shul in Finchley Synagogue in London, I have the great pleasure of being able to lead a study group of covenants and conversation every week, where different members of the community sit together, we learn through these sheets, and we share insights. And it's something that I've really missed during the lockdown. So it's great to be able to come together, albeit virtually, and also to be able to expand so that more people can study together as well via the amazing technology of Facebook Live. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you'll enjoy the next 40 minutes or so. Now, an enormous thanks must go, of course, to Rabbi Stacks for providing these wonderful materials week after week, year after year for us, and inspiring us in the rabbinate and so many other people over the years. And also to Joanna, Dan, and Debbie in Rabbi Sachs's office, and of course to the Morriswold Charitable Trust for supporting this venture. Particular thanks, though, go to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Daniel Rose, formerly of the North Bank High Bari, but nowadays of Modi'in in Israel. Dr. Rose puts together the Covenant and Conversation Family Edition each week, taking different elements of Rabbi Sachs's writings, adding the thoughts to ponder, adding discussion points, and really making this into a wonderfully polished and accessible introduction to Rabbi Sachs's thought and to understanding how he views the parasha every week. So a big thank you to Dr. Daniel Rose. Now, what is the Family Edition? Some of you might be wondering this. I'm sure you've all heard of Rabbi Sachs's Covenant and Conversation, which, as I mentioned, is distributed weekly and is made into a number of books, published, of course, by our friends at Koren and Maggid Press. But the Family Edition is something a little bit different. What happens is that Dr. Rose takes, as I mentioned, Rabbi Sachs's materials. He puts them together in a way that helps parents particularly to engage with children when studying the parasha through the prism of Rabbi Sachs's thought. And I found in our sessions in Kinloss that it's not just great for children, but it's great for adults as well, which is another one of the reasons why we're having this particular session today. Not just a great intro to Rabbi Sachs's thought, but also to understanding ways of analyzing the parasha, particularly with a view to our contemporary times and the relevance and resonance of the parasha to our times. And that's what we'll see, I think, especially in a few minutes' time when we get into the actual handouts. By the way, if you haven't downloaded the handouts, you can do so. They are provided in the description of the comments, and of course, they are being shared. They'll be shared on the screen as well. And my thanks to my colleague Richard Verber, who, as ever, is guiding us through our tech and production. So, how are we going to do this? We're going to use the handouts, which I said you can download or you can see on the screen. Thank you, Richard, for putting up the link to that. And you'll see that there are various sections from Rabbi Sachs's writing on the handout, starting with the parasha in a nutshell, then moving on to a core idea, then a story and some further readings. And each of these have thoughts to ponder, and they have discussion questions on the fourth page of the handout as well. We're going to look at the first two or possibly three sections today, depending on time. And I hope that you'll take the fourth section, thinking more deeply, and be able to read that later on or at home, or perhaps share it over the Shabbat table with others if you're fortunate enough to be able to do so. So that's what we're going to do in terms of our structure. Of course, normally in Kinloss on Shabbat mornings, we can discuss. On Facebook, it's slightly different, but please do feel free to use the comments facility to send in either questions or comments or suggestions, etc. And I'll do my best to see if we can take some of them and address some of them, particularly if they're things which you want to try and develop and they're things which you want to ask about the material. So hopefully that sets the scene for us. And with that in mind, let's go. Now, here's the handout. And thank you again, Richard, for sharing it. And we'll start with the key idea. And one of the things which Rabbi Sachs particularly taught us in the rabbinate was to make sure that every sermon has a destination. There is one particular idea which you are focusing on and you are teaching to people and emphasizing through the sermon. It's something which has helped me enormously over the years. And we see over here there is a key idea as well, which we're going to follow throughout our study of this week's Family Edition. And the key idea is as follows. Thinking about consequences helps us to make good choices, particularly relevant given the situation the world is in at the moment. I want you to try and keep that at the forefront of your mind. Almost right-click, minimize it to the bottom of the screen, so to speak, and it will flash up in your mind. Thinking about consequences helps us to make good choices. And particularly in our current situation, our current context, what lessons are we learning from what's going on? How will our world look once, please God, COVID-19 is defeated? How will we have learned those lessons and made a better world ahead? What are the consequences of our actions to date and now? And how are we going to use these to help us make good choices? And remarkably enough, this, as you'll see, is a central theme in this week's double parasha, Bahar and Bechukotai, with which we end the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. So we'll go now to the, the first section on the handout, which is the parasha in a nutshell, just overviewing what the parasha contains, some of its main themes and content, and again, relating them to this key idea of the week, thinking about our consequences, about the consequences to help us make good choices, especially given the world and the situation which we're in. So Rabbi Sachs writes as follows: Bahar is just a single chapter, but this short parasha has a very important message. It teaches us how to build a fair society where everyone is free, but also equal. One of the great aspirations, not just of the Torah, but also the Abdel, one would hope of any political system as well. A society where people are free, but are also equal. Sometimes you can have freedom without equality, such as in a country where everyone is free to do whatever job they wish and spend their money however they wish, but some people are poor and some are rich. So not everyone is equal. This, of course, is called a capitalist free economy, which we are very familiar with. And sometimes you can have equality without freedom, where everyone has the same, but the government takes away a lot of choices. For example, communism or socialism. Communism, thank God, we are not so familiar with these days, but I'm sure many people watching will remember the dark old days of the Soviet Union and the communist grip on Eastern Europe, and just how those words would resonate with people who were trapped there. But rarely do we see both together, the mixture of the good of capitalism and the good of potentially of communism or of socialism, I think more accurately instead. So already you can see that in the parasha this week, there is what we might call today a form of political theory, thinking about the way we organize our society for the betterment of everyone, thinking about the decisions which we make and how they will impact on everybody, not just now, but also into the future. And that's a point which we will come back to later on. Rabbi Sachs continues in the third paragraph on the left-hand side. The powerful insight of the Torah is that you can have both, but not at the same time. Therefore, time itself has to become part of the solution in the form of the seventh year, the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, when of course all crops and would lie fallow, fields would lie fallow, and we were not allowed to work the lands in the land of Israel. We couldn't work the fields. And after 7 sabbatical cycles, the 50th year, the Yovel, the Jubilee. These two points in our calendar, allowing for the lands to lie fallow and people to perhaps spiritually reconnect during the Shemitah year, and the Yovel, when in biblical times those who were serving a form of servitude, free land would return to its ancestral owners to make sure that nobody was going to be permanently without land to live on in the land of Israel. These times work as corrections to the inequalities caused by the free market that allow some to become rich, while others suffer the loss of land, home, and even freedom. It's almost as if the Torah is giving us a check and a balance within the system of any society. Say, hold on, time will help you, explains Rabbi Sachs, fix when things go off kilter. If you use the Shemitah, use the Yovel properly, that will help you to get back on the track you need to be, the yellow brick road, if I can call it that way, which is helping us to try and get the best of both of these systems. So that's Bahar, the first of our 2 sidrot this week. As you can see, again, consequences are very important here. The decisions we make in the society we build, the way we use time and opportunities will have, of course, as we know, profound consequences and we have to think about these to help us make the correct choices. Now, Bechokotai follows on from this in a very stark way. Bechokotai, of course, is the second of our two parashiot this week, and what ends the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Now, Bechokotai, we're on the right-hand side in the second paragraph, is mainly God speaking about the blessings that the Israelites will receive if they keep the Torah, and the curses, the bad things that will happen to them if they do not. Just to give some context, when Bnei Israel heard these words, they were still camped near Mount Sinai. They had not yet traveled on from their experience at Mount Sinai, from constructing the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and in their minds they were getting ready to go as soon as possible to the land of Israel. Of course, a plan which was foiled by the reaction to the sin of the scouts or the spies in the Parashat Shalach Lecha, which we'll read, please God, in a few weeks' time, which led to the eventual and total 40 years of wandering in the desert. Perhaps the people were not quite ready yet to go into the land, which is why they panicked, in a sense, at that particular time and needed the extra opportunities in the desert to be ready to enter the land of Israel. But at this point, the people are hearing about blessings and curses they will receive if they keep the Torah, and vice versa, God forbid, if they don't. Particularly with in mind, thinking that they were on their way to the land of Israel. They'd left Egypt, they received the Torah, they got their mission, so to speak, their covenant from God, and they should have been on their way as soon as possible to Israel to put that into practice in the place where, as the Torah tells us, God's eyes are always on it, and there are greater spiritual opportunities than anywhere else. Now, if we believe that God acts in history, rewards the good, and punishes the bad, then we can have hope that somehow there is a plan to all that is going on. And this is an idea that was given to the world by the Torah. The remarkable statement at the end of the curses that whatever happens, God will not reject his people, provides us with eternal hope throughout Jewish history. That even if we make the wrong decisions and they have bad consequences, as sadly has happened too many times in our history, nonetheless we are reassured that God will be with us. This is part of being the Jewish people. This links us back to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the covenants they made with God as well, which are linking to this covenant over here, where God said, I'm going to be with you. Whatever happens, I'm going to be with you. And this is sometimes difficult for us to relate to, understandably so, but here is the guarantee. And the Torah is telling us this, that we have to have this kind of hope. And please God, we should always feel it and always enjoy it in the best of times. Now, in the current context, as we mentioned before, what lessons are we learning, therefore, from what's going on around us? How are we going to have this hope? How are we going to try and build a better society than the one that existed before COVID-19? What lessons can we take out of it? This is what this section is challenging us to think about. And as Dr. Rose puts in the question to ponder, how can each of these two parashiot give us hope? How can they help us do that? Let me share with you briefly a story which always resonates with me on these parashiot. I heard it from Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, who's of course the rabbi of the Tanakh at front, and a great builder and educator amongst the Jewish people. Rabbi Riskin, as a child, went to the shtivel, the small shul in Brooklyn, of the Klausenberg Sands Rabbi, who had suffered terribly during the war, a remarkable person, suffered terribly during the war. He had gone to America, he recreated a community in America, and in his shul, during this particular reading, as we'll see later on, the curses are read quietly. But this particular occasion, Rabbi Riskin recalls, he was a child at the time, he recalls the Rebbe saying, I want the reading to be loud. He banged on the table, louder, he said in Yiddish. So of course, that's what the person reading the Torah did. People said afterwards, why? It's not the practice to do this. To which the Rebbe responded to words which give me goosebumps whenever I hear it, I think of them. He said, we've had curses already. This was in the early 1950s. It's time for us to keep having hope. It's time to have the blessings. And not long afterwards, he moved to Netanya in Israel. He set up the Laniado Hospital and all of the infrastructure around that, and very much lived this idea of the blessings coming and the hope. A tremendously inspiring person. And you can read more about that Laniado Hospital in a wonderful piece in the US and Koren's Machzor for Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, in the other days, a piece written by Rabbi Chaim Fachler, who worked in that hospital and shares some amazing recollections of the Klaus Sandsberger Rabbi. So that's our first section, which is Bahar Kotai in a nutshell. Let's move on to the next section, which is the core idea. See coming up on your screen now. Now, as an introduction to this, bearing in mind our key idea, let's think about the purpose of blessings and curses. And we've heard from the Klausenberger Rebbe how he related to these, and I said in a way which is quite incredible. And I feel like I'm sitting in the dust of his feet, to use the phraseology from Pirkei Avot, even mentioning it. So what might the purpose be that we can think of, at least in our limited human capacity, of blessings and curses, and how might we consider these at this particular moment? Now, the book of Vayikra, says the core idea, ends with blessings and curses. The blessings will be the result if the people keep their covenant with God. The curses will happen to them if they break their promises. The general principle, says Rabbi Sachs, is clear. If people behave well, the nation will do well. If they behave badly, eventually bad things will happen. This seems to be the general direction of what the blessings and the curses teach us. And of course, even looking from a different view, if people do things well, generally, things we hope will go well because of that. If they do things in a sloppy or bad manner, then it's not likely to work out so well. Now, there's a custom, as we mentioned, to read the Tochacha, the curses section of Kotai, both here and in the parallel passage in Devarim, chapter 28, in a low voice in the synagogue, which makes them a little less terrifying than if they were said out loud. But they are awful enough, however they are read. And both here and in Devarim, the section on curses is longer and far more graphic than the section on blessings. As we noted at the beginning of this section, why might this be the case? Why more emphasis on curses than on blessings? What is the Torah teaching us? What is the purpose of such a presentation? What is the message? So Rabbi Sachs continues, amplifying this. This seems to contradict a basic principle of Judaism, that God's generosity to those who are faithful to him is far more than his punishment of those who are not. How do we deal with this? The whole idea contained in the 13 attributes of compassion taught in Shemot chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, familiar particularly, I think, in our context here in the UK from the readings of the Torah on fast days and on Shabbat Chol HaMoed as well, is that God's love and forgiveness are stronger than his justice and punishment. Why, therefore, are the curses in this week's parasha so much longer and so much more emphasized than the blessings? It's not just the general principle of why would this be the case, but how do we square this with God's attributes of compassion, which say that love and forgiveness are stronger than justice and punishment? So turning the page, if you print it out, about at the top of page 2, as you can see on your screen if you're following there, the answer is that God loves and forgives, but on the condition that when we do wrong, we admit it, show we regret the act, make it up to those who we have harmed, and repent. In other words, every action has a consequence, as we said in the key idea. How do we think about the consequences of those actions? There is, so to speak, a spiritual response to it through the choices we make, not just a physical response. Making good isn't necessarily just a physical way of making good, but making us good as well. Having the sense of awareness of God, the awareness of what it means to be a Jew, the awareness of the kinds of people we are meant to be, to help us make good as well. Especially if that means making good with other people. In the middle of the 13 attributes of mercy is this statement. Yet he, God, does not leave the guilty unpunished. God does not forgive the sinner who doesn't repent, because were he to do so, it would make the world a worse place, not a better one. More people would sin if there were no downside to doing so. Now that's a really, I find, personally speaking, a very, very powerful idea. That somehow our consequences are not just for us, but for others as well. Even in the spiritual sense. If we are to sin, maybe it'll encourage other people to sin as well. If we haven't corrected things, made them right. There will be a knock-on effect on so many others. Just as one act of kindness can cause good, then an act which is bad can cause the opposite. I recall very impactfully from Rabbi Sachs's writings into To Heal a Fractured World, how he tells a story which we were able to reproduce in the US Shiva book, which the late Amos Oz, of course, the famous Israeli novelist, related. The story goes something like this. That when Amos Oz was a child, his father was writing a book. It was an academic book, and he spent a long, long time writing it. And after many years, it was finally published, and there'd been stress in the family because of this book. It was a project which meant that his father was often under pressure and often unavailable. And finally, the book was published. Mr. Oz Sr. came in, heaved a sigh of relief. Finally, the book is published. And everybody else heaved a big sigh of relief as well. The book's there. A couple of days later, though, Mr. Oz Sr. came in, but he wasn't happy. He said, the book is still on the shelf. No one's buying my book. They're buying me other books. What's going on? And this obviously was very worrying. Another dampener, another cloud settled on the house. A couple of days after this, as the story goes, Amos Oz was sent to go and by his father to go and borrow a bag of milk from one of the neighbors. It shows you this is a story in the land of Israel, bags of milk. He knocked on the neighbor's door. He went in. The neighbor said, sure, sit in the lounge. I'll get you a bag of milk from the kitchen. Amos Oz went in. He looked at the lounge. His jaw dropped. This little boy, jaw dropped. On the table in the lounge were all 5 copies of his father's book from the local bookshop. Now the neighbor came in and realized what had happened, realized that the game was up. And he said, don't you ever tell your father what I've done. I just wanted to do one act of kindness, one act of chesed. I don't want your father to know. Don't tell him, but you know. Just don't share it with him, please. I don't want him to think that this is the case. And his father came in later that day and said, oh, I'm a best-selling author. All the books have sold out. Fantastic. And the cloud lifted from the Oz household. Now, did anybody know, anybody think at the time, let alone Amos Oz, that he would share that story with Rabbi Sachs, who shared it with us at a rabbinical conference a number of years ago. I'm sure shared it with others around the world in other places, put it into his writings. And the resonance of that one small act of kindness continues to spread. It's like a stone thrown into water and the ripples just keep going. That is the power of good and of good decisions. And God forbid, Rahman al-Islam, from the other perspective, vice versa, of bad decisions, the consequences of them. Very, very powerful lesson. And Rabbi Sachs teaches us this very, perhaps cutting, but very important point, which is about how God was to not allow sin somehow to be responded to, that would make the world a worse place. Now, the reasons the curses are so dramatic, Rabbi Sachs continues, this is the second paragraph on the left. The reason the curses are so dramatic is not because God seeks to punish, but the exact opposite. The Talmud tells us that God weeps when he allows disaster to strike his people. Woe to me, that due to their sins I destroyed my house, burned my temple, and exiled them, my children, among the nations of the world. The Talmud at the beginning, almost at the beginning of the whole Talmud, Brachot, page 3a, so to speak, quotes God as saying that the curses were meant as a warning. They were intended to put off, scare, and discourage. And if one particularly learns the final parts, or at least the parts leading up to the destruction of the temple in the book of Jeremiah, the book of Yirmiyahu, you see this idea coming out so clearly. Poor Yirmiyahu, day after day, month after month, having to say to the people, say to the leaders, change things. Your society is rotten. If you don't change it and fix it, there are going to be awful consequences. Being accused, Yirmiyahu was accused of being a traitor, a spy, a defeatist, all of these things, put into jail, put into stocks. But sadly, ultimately, and tragically, particularly to him, he was proven right. When the state of society was such, it would seem that the first temple could no longer exist. Jerusalem was destroyed. Of course, this is the end of the first temple period, and many more Jews taken into exile in Babylon. This idea of the Talmud, I think, resonates very much with what's in Yirmiyahu. They were intended to put off, scare, discourage. They are like a parent warning a young child not to play with electricity because it's dangerous. The parent may deliberately intend to scare the child, but they do so out of love, not severity. Fascinating idea. Again, not an easy one necessarily, but a fascinating idea. And again, thinking about our current perspective, I think it challenges us to think what lessons we can learn. I think this is for everybody to think about in their own lives, come to their own conclusions. But what lessons as individuals, and then as we act as societies, do we need to try and learn? There's one other point from Rabbi Sachs's writings I want to bring into this. And this is something which is also into To Heal a Fractured World, and was actually referenced by somebody I don't know, whose name is Yehuda Fogel, as a retweeted onto Rabbi Sachs's Twitter feed. And this was in response to the very sad passing a number of days ago of Rabbi Dr. Nachum Rabinovich, Zichrono Livracha, who was Rabbi Sachs called his own Rav, and related to him in that way. And you'll see on Rabbi Sachs's social media feed very moving hespedim, eulogies and thoughts about Rabbi Rabinovich. But Rabbi Rabinovich, who was originally from North America, spent some time in the UK as the principal of Jews College, and latterly was the Rosh Yeshiva of Birkat Moshe in Ma'ale Adumim, north of Jerusalem in Israel, was one of the great rabbinic figures of recent decades, particularly combining not just rabbinic knowledge, but secular knowledge as well. Anybody I've met who studied Rabbi Rabinovich, sadly, I did not have the opportunity to study directly with him, but anybody I have, particularly people who are on the faculty in Jews College and some of our Rabbanim today, Diane Binstock, for instance, shared some memories with me, speaks so highly of Rabbi Rabinovich. And in this extract from To Heal a Fractured World, which I said I'm grateful to Yehuda Fogel for posting, Rabbi Sachs quotes an idea based on the teachings of Rabbi Rabinovich, which help us think about what we've just read in this section of the core idea. And this is what the section says. If we were able to see how evil today leads to good tomorrow, if we were able to see from the point of view of God, creator of all, we would understand justice, but at the cost of ceasing to be human. We would accept all, vindicate all, and become deaf to the cries of those in pain. God does not want us to cease to be human, for if he did, he would not have created us. We are not God. We will never see things from his perspective. The attempt to do so is an abdication of the human situation. My teacher, Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, taught me that this is how to understand the moment when Moses first encountered God at the burning bush. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God, the Torah in Shemot, chapter 3, verse 6 teaches us. Why was he afraid? Because if he were to fully understand God, he would have no chance to be Moshe, no chance to fight against injustice. And of course, at that point by the burning bush, Moshe was soon to be sent back to Egypt to fight injustice, to deliver the messages to Paro, to play his role in the Exodus, in the coming out of Bnei Israel from Egypt. Very, very powerful idea. So I think these ideas and what we've seen in the core idea, I hope give us some perspective. There are some questions which we just can't answer because we are human and they are beyond us, but they give us some perspectives, some ways of thinking about them, and also in particular, coming back to our key idea, thinking about our actions and what the consequences will be when we react to things. What kind of people do we want to be? What kind of world do we want to build? Sometimes, of course, it's very, very difficult. But this is a way to try and help guide us as best we can. Now, let's move into the It Once Happened section. In fact, I'm just going to look at some of the comments just in case any of you have sent any particular questions to relate to. Just bear with me a second. Okay, thanks everyone for all of your comments, and also wonderful to see Jews united from so many places around the world. So that's even though we can't be together physically, how wonderful that we can virtually, so to speak, make new friends and acquaintances, and thank you all for being here. But let's move into the It Once Happened section, which is on the second page, and you can see Richard has got a few at the top of your screen. Now this is a beautiful story, and as our introduction to it, I want you to please think about opportunities to do good and never taking things for granted. And this links us also back to Dr. Rose's questions to ponder from the previous section about how punishments can be given in love Let's see if we can find an example of this in It Once Happened, and also a time when you received a warning and whether it affected your behavior or not. So let's see what we learn from this beautiful story. Again, looking for opportunities to do good, never taking things for granted, and thinking about the role of punishment. Lou Ann Johnson was a retired US Marine who decided to become a teacher as a second career. But she soon found the job was more of a challenge than she could ever have imagined. When she arrived on her first day, she found that she would be teaching a group of tough, hostile teenagers from underprivileged backgrounds. This is even difficult, I say even with emphasis, for someone who served as a US Marine. Many of her students were involved in gang warfare and drug dealing. Not one was motivated to learn, and they all refused to cooperate or listen to her at all. Lou Ann was desperate to reach the students and make a difference in their lives, and tried to persuade them to learn in numerous ways, including using contemporary music, teaching them karate, using themes and language of the street, helping our students to connect their reality to the subjects they were studying. Okay? This is innovative teaching in an amazing way. It's, I suppose, also connected to those who were fortunate enough to learn hadracha techniques in youth groups and elsewhere, ways which we approach life as well, rather than just going for the straight line, so to speak. What other ways can we try and impart messages and values, particularly when dealing in a school setting? But this, of course, is so important in everyday life as well. She even rewarded their efforts with candy bars, reward incentives, and a trip to the theme park, much to the anger of the school authorities. I guess in her school they didn't have Lag BaOmer trips or even virtual Lag BaOmer trips, as our very innovative teachers have put together for children, certainly in London, I'm sure in other places this year. Now, these creative approaches had various degrees of success, but she finally found the secret to motivate her students when she had the idea to give each of them an A grade for the whole year at the beginning of the semester. Now, this is revolutionary. I wish this had been the case when I was in school. Why would she do this? She told them that she believed deep down that each of them deserved the A and had the potential to achieve it. It was there for the taking. Now, all they had to do was maintain it by working hard throughout the year. Sometimes being given something in reward is less effective at motivating us than the threat of losing something. Now, that's a fascinating idea. Just ponder it for a moment. As Dr. Rose writes, what lesson can we learn from it for everyday life? I think everybody should try and ponder this and think, wait a second, there are things that I might lose, God forbid. How motivating is that for me? And how does this relate to the parasha? Perhaps it helps us answer our questions as to why there is more emphasis on the curses than the blessings. Because look at what we might lose if we don't act properly. We might lose by having, God forbid, these curses come about. That should be a motivating factor, as we saw in the core idea as well, that God should, so to speak, say, as quoted in the Gemara in Brachot, woe to me that these things would ever have to happen. Much rather that everybody had got it and had avoided it. One of, I think, the key lessons of Jewish history. Halavai, they got it right, rather than getting it wrong. Halavai, they looked forward and thought about the consequences of their actions. And thinking particularly about looking to the future and seeing its impact on others, as we've discussed with Rabbi Sachs's writings and the stories about Amos Oz and others. There's a very powerful comment in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which we read, of course, on Shabbat afternoon to this time of the year. And the Mishnah reads as follows. I'm looking, of course, in the green siddur over here, which is has Rabbi Sachs's translation and commentary. And in chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot, in this edition, it's Mishnah 13. The students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the great rabbinic figures who did so much to rebuild Judaism in Yavne after the destruction of the Second Temple around the year 70 CE, he asked some of his leading students, he said to them, go out and see what is the derech tovah sheyidbak b'ha'adam, the good way, the good path that a person should cling to. As Rabbi Sachs says, the right way that one should cling to. And one of the answers is that of Rabbi Shimon, who says, Haro'eh et hanolad. The good path is somebody who sees what's going to happen, the consequences of their actions. The other answers given are things like Rabbi Eliezer says, have a good eye, look at things favorably. Rabbi Yehoshua says, Chaberto, have a good friend who will help you and support you. And there are a number of other suggestions as well. But Rabbi Shimon's Haro'eh Hanolad, see the consequences of your actions. What can we learn from thinking about potential rewards and potential consequences? And Rabbi Yisrael Merelau, of course, famous as the former chief rabbi of Israel, but his wonderfully inspiring biography, and a person who has taught and inspired thousands of Jews around the world. In his commentary on Pirkei Avot, addresses this point, and he notes that a wise person ultimately, quoting of course from the book of Kohelet, as is well known, is someone who has eyes in their head. In other words, they are looking to the future. They are thinking, what are the consequences of my actions, not just for me, but for other people as well? What is it that I can do to make sure that I'm going on the right path, as this Mishnah tells us, and I'm helping that path be good for others? I'm helping to do things that will also help other people. And I think that this rabbinic teaching in Pirkei Avot, and that of Rabbi Lau as well, amplifies this very clever approach of Lou Ann Johnson, who said, think about what you might lose rather than what you actually might gain. That could be even more motivating. Just before we summarize, I want to conclude, bearing in mind it's Yom Yerushalayim next week, with something that Rabbi Sachs wrote in Radical Now, Radical Then, about Yom Yerushalayim, which we again were grateful to Rabbi Sachs for letting us reprint in our Mahzor for Yom HaTzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, etc., that I mentioned before. Rabbi Sachs writes how he was a student in Cambridge at the time. And when the Six-Day War took place, he says something extraordinary began to happen as people realized the existential threat in the eve of the Six-Day War to the state of Israel and the Jewish people, the sandbags being made in Tel Aviv, the trenches being dug, the extra areas, God forbid, for funerals which were being prepared and burials. Rabbi Sachs said throughout the university, Jews suddenly became visible. Day after day, they crowded into the little synagogue in the center of town. Students and dons who had never publicly identified as Jews could be found there praying. Everyone wanted to help in some way to express their solidarity, their identification with Israel's fate. It was some time before we realized, said Rabbi Sachs, that the same phenomenon was being repeated throughout the world. The war was fought and won, and life again, when people celebrated and breathed again, went back to normal, but not completely. And again, in our circumstance now, I imagine life will not go back to normal, quote unquote, as it was before. Rabbi Sachs says, life didn't go back to normal completely. For I'd witnessed something in those days and weeks that made no sense in the rest of my world. It had nothing to do with politics or even prayer. It had to do with Jewish identity. Collectively, the Jewish people looked in the mirror and said, we are still Jews. This was more than a private declaration of faith or religion in a conventional sense. It meant they felt part of the people, involved in its fate, implicated in its destiny, caught up in its tragedy, exhilarated by its survival. I had felt it, so had every Jew I knew. Why? The Israelis were not people I knew. Rabbi Sachs said he'd visited the country. It was, of course, wasn't so easy in those days, but he'd visited. He had no plans to live there, yet he had no doubt that their danger was something he felt personally. It was then, he said, I knew that being Jewish was not something private and personal, but collective and historical. It meant being part of an extended family, many of whose members I did not know, but to whom I nonetheless felt connected by bonds of kinship and responsibility. It made no sense in the categories and concepts of the 1960s. It wasn't something even that I could choose, said Rabbi Sachs. It was something that I was born into. Even though I'd studied in modern philosophy that everything and experience in contemporary culture told me that truth was universal and all else was individual, what I'd experienced now was not. It didn't add up logically, psychologically it did. Without any conscious decision, I was reminded that merely by being born into the Jewish people, I was enmeshed into a network of relationships that connected me to other people, other places, other times. I belonged to a people. and being part of a people, I belonged. Now, I find these words incredibly powerful, and I reread them often, particularly in the run-up to Yom Yerushalayim, but at other times as well. Thinking about those lessons in the Six-Day War, what were people thinking then? What were the consequences going to be of their actions? Not just politically, but on a personal level, as we learn even from those people in Cambridge. And I'm sure some of you watching will remember that yourselves as well. So going back to our original idea, if you turn to page 3, and we will conclude with just a very short excerpt from Rabbi Sacks's latest book, Morality, which has just been published and is available on Amazon and other places online. There is nothing inevitable about the division, fragmentation, extremism, and isolation, the economics of inequality, or the politics of anger that have been the mood of Britain and America in recent years. They have been the legacy of the misplaced belief that societies can function without a moral bond. They cannot, or at least not for long. That is why we are where we are. But we can change. Societies have moved from I to we in the past. They did so in the 19th century. They did so in the 20th century. They can do so in the future. And it begins with us. Again, thinking about consequences helps us to make good choices. So I hope you've seen not just an introduction, at least for some of you, to Rabbi Sacks's thought and the wonderful presentations that Dr. Rose puts together for us. But I hope you've also seen a summary of what's in our parasha, some of the tremendous relevance which the parasha always has, but especially to our situation today. So thinking about the societies we build, the role of individuals within that, to trying to think about what the purpose might be of blessings and curses, and please God, we should always have blessings. To think about the examples of people like Luann, we read about as the amazing teacher in the United States, Luann Johnson, and to think about the lessons of Rabbi Rabinovich, Zichrono Livracha, and others, in understanding the core idea and really what we're trying to achieve. So I wish you all well. Please God, the whole world should have healing. The whole world should have blessing. Thank you for joining us. Do join us next Thursday as well. And once again, a big thanks to everybody, Rabbi Sacks's team, who puts the materials together, and to Dr. Rose, to Richard Verb for keeping us online. I wish you Shabbat Shalom and all the very best.